Welcome to Found in Translation, a weekly-ish episode of one fellow's translation of the Christian scriptures, one chapter at a time. My name is Brandon Rhodes, and across the internet from me is the translator himself, Brandon Johnson. Hey, Brandon.
Hey, Brandon.
Here we are at the end of all things Hebrews. We have made it to the conclusion of Priscilla's magnificent piece of literature here, talking about, among other things, the way in which solidarity and sharing and getting beyond scapegoating is all outworkings of the way in which Christ is the fullness of every other thing, every other good thing in this life, in this world. And here she is bringing it home, sliding into home base with a few kind of summary ideas, as well as one final foray into the cultic imagination. So we're going to go through that and then just sort of re-summarize what we've learned along the way here in Hebrews before we take another break between seasons. Ready to get into this?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Why don't you bring that up on the screen and we'll read through that. Yeah. I should say, as always, dear viewers and listener, if you haven't had a chance to read Brandon's translation, it's worth not just doing here on the screen in our feed, but in the episode notes, whether you're on YouTube or a podcast player or Facebook. There's a link to a variety of different formats of Brandon's translation. It's always worth taking your time to reflect on these things, as well as reading his footnotes, which we will not be doing on air. So if you need to, hit pause and do that. Otherwise, we're just going to jump right in. Brandon, would you be willing to read that entire first paragraph? Seems like most of what we're going to talk about lives there.
Okay. Familial love must stay present. Do not neglect welcoming strangers, because through it some have welcomed messengers as guests unknowingly. Be mindful of those in prison, as if you have been imprisoned along with them. And be mindful of those who are being mistreated, as if within the same body. Marriage must be held as precious among everyone, and the bed uncontaminated. God will determine what is just regarding sex workers and people who engage in marital infidelity. How you live must be free of greed, having been satisfied with what is available. You see, he has said, I will absolutely not desert you and absolutely not abandon you. So then we say with confidence, the Lord is a helper to me, and I won't be terrified. What will a person do to me? Be mindful of those of you who act as guides, who spoke God's conversation among you. As you observe the outcomes of how they live, imitate their faithfulness. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Yeah, what a summary of a lot, and a bringing together of a lot of different points, and therefore is all together in one place.
Yeah, it's there's a reason why we started this whole season with this paragraph. It really does capture the point of most of the whole book.
Yeah, it sure does. So the first translation to talk about here is, I'm just scrolling through my notes. I guess welcoming strangers there towards the beginning. Well, actually, familial love. What else? How's that usually?
Yeah. Traditionally, it's brotherly love, which isn't wrong. What we've talked about before, the word Delphos brother. That's its like primary definition, but it means siblings just as legitimately as it means brother. It's in Greek when you have a mixed gender group, you default grammatically to the masculine form.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's also used of cousins and even like fellow members of the same ethnic group.
Mm-hmm.
It where Adelphos has really broad ways of using it. It's like members of the same family or group.
Mm-hmm.
So familial love fits really well. Um, and honestly, like going back just in this previous chapter, it mentions Abel, talking about Esau, and doesn't mention Jacob by name, but
Yeah.
strongly implied in the story there. Um, don't be like Jacob. Familial love must stay present. Don't be
Mm.
like Cain. Familial love must stay present.
Yeah. Neither murder nor hustle and extort your brother.
Yeah. In fact, not only your brother, but even strangers. Include
Mm-hmm.
them, welcome them in fully, and take care of them. Like, not just don't do them harm, but actively promote the well being of strangers.
Mm-hmm.
Take
She
care of them.
immediately escalates it. Don't just like look to the end. Don't just be loyal to the insiders, but to those who are outside of that designation,
Mm-hmm.
because they may actually be the, those who mediate the divine to you.
Mm-hmm.
Messengers, what we've often called angels. What's this? What must stay present? That's a interesting phrase. It,
Mm-hmm.
it it comes across a very contemplative spirituality kind of phrase. Mysticism uses a lot of presence language.
Yeah.
What the
More
hell is he at
traditional
this?
would be like must remain, um, which is not wrong, but since translating John, I've had a pretty keen awareness of the idea of staying or being present or staying present as like kind of a controlling center for that word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Um, and there's a sense of it doesn't just like still exist, but it's active and here and yeah,
it's a difference
like
between
it remaining can be just like oh yeah it hasn't like disappeared, it's somewhere out there, but
yeah, it's active versus passive. It's the difference between hearing and listening.
mm-hmm,
Like remaining is just being there. To like in the biblical imagination, the sense of presence is engaged. There's a
mm-hmm,
attentive, even if it's not um, moving in a sense. There is some sense of like activity to it. It's an active thing.
mm-hmm,
Like don't like
yeah,
so. Priscilla is not saying um, sen, tender sentimentality must be among you.
no, it's got to be something you can
Yeah,
see how it's
familial
showing
love
up.
must stay present, must be engaged. Like it's uh, in us. It lives and moves and has our being, has its being.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm,
yeah, and extend that to strangers too.
yeah, and I love the I translate it as welcoming strangers. Traditionally, it's hospitality, which isn't wrong. It's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I did welcoming strangers because of the components of the word there that translated hospitality.
Oh,
It's so if you think xenophobia,
hmm.
being afraid of the other,
Yeah.
this has this is the other words, uh, philoxenia. So putting the xeno at the end instead of the beginning and flipping from phobia to philia. But it's the opposite of xenophobia. Instead of being afraid and wanting to stay away and repel the other, it's loving and wanting to be close to and drawing in the other.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yeah. And
We
so she
might
can,
call it other love.
yeah. Yeah. And even practice other love, which, gets at
Mm-hmm.
this like long-standing theme in, um, this seems to be a place where it really ruptures to the surface of like, this is how one of the ways you combat scapegoating. Scapegoating is this instinct to, um, find your security through the exclusion of certain people
Mm-hmm.
or even their death. Like, how do we resolve the crisis of scarcity and difference among us? How does our fears feel slaked?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody just needs to be hit. It's like, well, no, actually, like lean into your curiosity and love and tenderness towards the stranger, not towards people who are going to cause active harm to you, but get over your purity codes.
Mm-hmm.
Or don't let your purity codes be what keeps you from um the fullness of divine love.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And she continues on like, and like, hey, that goes for people who are in prison. um and then it takes a strange turn here.
Yeah.
Marriage must be held as precious among everyone in the bed uncontaminated. God will determine what is just regarding sex workers and people who engage in marital infidelity. How you live must be free from greed, having been satisfied with what is available.
Mm-hmm.
How do you you made some translation changes here?
A little bit. I just kind of like adultery to like marital infidelity,
Mm-hmm.
prostitutes to sex workers.
Yeah. So you did some people first language instead of like adulterers as like a permanent status or category
Right.
too.
Um, yeah. With the context in mind here, and context back in the previous chapter of people who are engaging in sex work are those who have been abandoned by the community and forced to do that to survive. Um, and so if there's guilt being pointed to anybody, it's the community, not the sex worker. Um, but yeah, so I think the same thing is here. If we're talking about familial love must stay present, don't neglect strangers. Uh, Treat people in prison as if they're you. People being mistreated as if they're you.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden, marriage must be held as precious. Like, it's not just saying don't sleep around. There's a oppressive injustice happening there that it's referring to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and stop it. Stop using people
Yeah.
as objects.
Well,
Whatever
and
is specifically in mind there, I'm not certain, but something along those lines is that happening.
sure. Um, and elsewhere I think it was a lot in Matthew talking about how um sexual immorality language or lust language, these are often economic terms applied to people.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Sexual exploitation.
mm-hmm. Yeah. And so here we are, like it, in verse 5, how you right after the like sex workers and marital infidelity stuff, there's how you live must be free from greed, have been satisfied with what's available.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you have like she's saying like, hey, look, God's going to figure out what to do with those characters. Um, but if you can live beyond greed and live in a space of gratitude, you're doing two things are happening at once here. It's actually resolving the question of infidelity and sex workers from both
Mm-hmm.
ends of things. if you're bothered by
Right.
the presence of sex workers, learn how to live in gratitude, you who are rich, and provide for, practice hospitality for the
Mm-hmm.
women and men who are in a trade that they may feel uncomfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like a supply, or like a supply side, and then a demand side thing is living with gratitude. um may like greed is um can be one of the toxic motives for um infidelity, or being employing the services of sex workers.
Mm-hmm.
So getting at it from supply and
Yeah.
demand without making any
Yeah.
effing judgment towards the people doing the work.
Yeah. It seems much more to me being about the married people
Mm-hmm.
who are contaminating their bed by using sex workers out of their greed.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what it's referring to here.
Mm-hmm.
Also noticing again that in most places where we have this word orne is feminine, but here and in the last chapter it's masculine.
Is it? You
Yeah,
said it in the last
which
chapter, but
yeah, so which
that's
just like Adelphos for brother, and it could be explicitly referring to male sex workers, or it could be just any sex workers of any gender because it's like more
mm-hmm.
inclusive of that's just how the Greek
Yeah.
language
Yeah.
works. It could be either one.
Yeah. It is worth noting, as since we've talked so much about sex workers, that a common refrain in people doing a lot of contextual work on this stuff is the two angles to understand about it. One, we've spent a lot of time talking about, and that is the role of economic exclusion and misogyny
Mhm.
in making particularly women kind of stuck with that as the last the first the first job is also their last resort. um the second is um a lot of the pagan or non-Jewish, non-Christian um temples had temple prostitutes, or had sex workers as part of like cultic practice. So sometimes there was the sense of like, yeah, don't to say don't get caught up in sex workers or whatever, is it was also a way of saying like, stay clear of the temples to other gods, and the entanglement of um oh, how do I say this, like sex with, there are certain modes of sex and sexuality with um appeasing gods, or cultic purpose, if that makes sense. So there is just a general effort to differentiate here, but I suppose it's neither here nor there.
Yeah, but yeah, in this context specifically, it seems to very much about continuing
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
greed and
Yeah,
be satisfied, and not just stop it, but you see, I will not abandon you or desert you. Like you don't have to put your effort into greed because God's going to make sure you have what you need
yeah,
through through the familial love primarily.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So like we're gonna see here, there's this real crescendo of in this chapter in which um the solution to scapegoating and greed and stinginess that leads to exploitation is gratitude and sharing. And
Mm-hmm.
that is constitutive of, those are two like bedrocks of what makes for our holiness, our being set apart.
Yeah,
These are our sacred purposes.
right. Going back to chapter 12,
Yep.
like the sacred purpose for which you've been designated, without which no one will see the Lord, is pursuing peace among everyone, not just non-conflict, but well-being
Mm.
among everyone.
Yeah,
And
flourishing is a way that
yeah,
that it's often translated. Shalom is often translated. Victory is another one in the
mm-hmm,
Jewish imagination. To
mm-hmm,
live communal with communal victory, with communal flourishing, that is holiness, and that
mm-hmm.
includes, that gets very practical about economics.
Yeah. And if you're doing that, then there's no root placed for resentment to take root,
Yeah.
and that leading to violence and all this other stuff. It's just like
Mm-hmm.
things are going to be good if you're taking care of each other. So the
Mm-hmm.
response to people doing things that avoid each other isn't so much punishment. It's make sure everyone has what they need, and there won't that just won't be a thing anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And that includes, like, in some sense here, there's a sense of the well off, the comfortable, like, it is so important now that you do the active spiritual inner work of trusting in divine provision and cultivating gratitude. That's what's going to open your hands up. Like, it is one of the places where Jesus and the early church are pretty comfortable just being really direct. Like, woe to you who are exploiting your workers. You're being dicks. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's one of the very few places where, like, there's um a raising of alarms and indictments is brought forth in the early church. And here, Priscilla, as a pastor, is also saying, uh, trust and gratitude are the postures and practices that are going to free you up to share. And sometimes you share first and then learn how to be grateful. Have less so that
Mm-hmm.
your heart can feel more.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. So you had a footnote here about, so continuing on, so then we say with confidence, the Lord is a helper to me, and I won't be terrified. What will a person do to me? You had a
Mm-hmm.
note there about the word helper. The Lord is a helper. Is that a
Oh,
reference to
yeah.
the Hebrew scriptures?
Yeah, it's from a quotation from Psalm 118,
Hmm.
um,
That's the really long
which,
one, right? No.
no, it's not the really long one. It's not short, but 119. Well, it depends
That's
on if
it.
you're Catholic or Protestant.
Yeah, fair.
Uh, so Catholic, yes, 118, but then this would be 117 for Catholics. Um,
Sorry about that.
yeah, but the reason I flagged it as wanting to mention it, we don't have to spend a lot of time on it. It's just any opportunity I can take to tear down the idea of a helpmeet as a thing, um, is one that I like to take. So this is the same word that's in help meet, which was never one word. It was always two words. Meet being an old English word for appropriate. So like when Eve is designated as a helper appropriate for Adam,
Mm.
um, this is the same word that the Lord is a helper. It's the same word. So like the helper is not like a subordinate assistant, unless you're thinking that the Lord is a subordinate assistant to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, well, I mean, if you're comfortable with that, then we can go with that with women too, I suppose. But my guess is that we're not comfortable with that.
Or the other way around. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not comfortable with either.
No,
So,
no, no. And then we've got be mindful of those of you who act as guides. It's usually leaders who spoke God's
mhm.
conversation among you. As you observe the outcomes of how they live, imitate their faithfulness.
Mhm.
I like guides. I like that more than leaders who act as
Yeah, I
guides.
mean, the word it really has to do with going ahead to like lead the way.
Mm-hmm.
So leaders is technically an appropriate word there, but we just have gotten so used to hearing leaders as being like the boss, the commanding general that says, you go do that,
Yeah.
rather than the one that's actually going ahead and leading the way at the front of the line.
Yeah. Like if we took the word literally of leader, that would be
Go
appropriate. But
out in the
because
lead.
leader is
Yeah.
equated with authority,
Hmm.
a particular kind of hierarchical pyramid kind of authority, those who are placed
Right.
above you, that kind of thing. Yeah, we need to. We could find a lot of healing in finding better words because suddenly the word leader is as we've often said and more in other seasons, it may be accurate, but it may be unfaithful.
Hmm. Yeah. And so, yeah, this is a sense of the people who have started walking the path earlier than you, and by following their example, you can see which way to go. But in the next sentence, you can see it's not just follow everything they do, it's as you observe the outcomes of how they live. Don't just imitate everything they do, imitate their faithfulness specifically. As you're observing the outcomes,
Yeah.
figure out which of their behaviors are faithful and imitate that.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is, I mean, so let's apply that to one of the most talked about um, tensions in the American church these days with the welcoming or exclusion, the humanization or dehumanization of queer folk.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if we're looking at how obedient to rules certain people are being when they
Mm-hmm.
kick out their kids for being not sufficiently cishet.
Mm-hmm.
um, but look at the outcomes of that teaching.
Familial love must stay present.
Familial love must stay present. Uh, you look to the consequences of that teaching. Look to the outcomes of how they live. Their kids
Mm-hmm.
have disowned them in turn. They have had some of them are a much higher rate of suicide attempts,
Mm-hmm. And
teenage queer
homelessness.
homelessness, like
Yeah.
70 over 75% of homeless youth are queer. Like this is an indictment of these are the outcomes of that of how certain Christians are living.
Mm-hmm.
Look to the fruit of their faith and then go from there. If it's causing a body count, run the F away. Like, but
Mm-hmm.
wherever you see good outcomes, figure out what's behind that and be faithful in the way that there.
Yeah. Because Jesus, Messiah, is the same yesterday and today and throughout the ages, going back to the beginning of Hebrews. Yeah, God's spoken lots of different ways in the past, but now he's spoken through the Son. Do like that's the message. But don't be swept away by varied and contrasting teachings, like
Yeah.
pick out your gay kids. You see, it's favorable for the heart to be made secure by generosity.
Mm.
Picking people out is the opposite of welcoming strangers. It doesn't sound a lot like familial love.
Yeah.
It's not generosity.
No, it is
And
not.
then we have this opaque for Western readers, not by food that doesn't benefit those nearby or those around.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How do we make sense of that, Brandon?
Sorry, my mind just got lost in something. Restate that, please.
Okay.
I was up with the angels there.
Oh yeah. Um, so if we're looking to what's faithful, what outcomes are faithful, what benefits the people around in generosity like Jesus.
Yes.
And then it's contrasting that with it's not being happening by food that doesn't benefit those nearby. And that gets a little confusing for us Westerners. It's like,
Right.
what are you talking about there?
Yeah. Yeah. And as we were talking off the air, like that's food that doesn't, was it food that doesn't nourish that's for those nearby? Like that's talking about food for the priests, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's talking about the sacrificial sacrifices
Mm-hmm.
where the priests were, which that's where the priests got their food was from the sacrifices.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And so much of this is like this next paragraph is there's not a ton of like big or load bearing translation changes that you made here, but it is the
right.
culmination of we can reread this passage um, in a more healthful, healing, and liberating way based on the translations you've made all throughout. Like so often, we've kind of had to work from the fringe to get to the cult language that is so woven throughout Hebrews.
Yeah. I just want to point out you're using cult like the technical, like sacrificial system
Cultic.
language and not
Yeah.
like the modern day cult.
No,
Like,
no, no. We're not talking about the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. We're not talking about Scientology. We're talking about the a priestly sacrificial um clerical imagination of how humans and the divine play together.
mm-hmm.
It is for most Protestants, particularly evangelical Protestants, quite foreign. um, there's a fair sense of that imagination in um, our Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox kin. But even then, like the sense of like the cultus of the ancient Hebrews is distinct and culturally
Mm-hmm.
different in its own way.
Yeah. So it's talking here, starting to bridge again. It did for several chapters earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus and that altar and sacrificial system in the tabernacle.
Yeah.
Um, and then it starts talking about the blood offered by the high priest concerning deviation in sacred places from animals whose bodies are burned outside the camp. And we looked this up. The reference here is from uh, Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
And while there is a element of it of sacrifice for deviation, it's not like the Day of Atonement. It's not specifically a
No.
sin offering.
No.
It specifically is talking about sacrifices that were offered as part of the ceremony for ordaining the priests.
Mm.
Uh, it's that, like we talked before, the ribbon cutting ceremony, the cleansing not being about it was bad before and now it's good. It was just general purpose before, and now it's for this specific sacred purpose. And that's
Yeah.
what it's talking about.
Yeah. Like
And
an
there is a
inauguration,
sense
like an
of
inauguration
leaving
parade.
behind. It's an inauguration, yep.
Yeah.
And there is a piece
And
of that where there's letting go of things that might be fine for the general public, but it doesn't work anymore for the specific person.
Yeah. Yep. And the purpose of like this sin offering is not to appease God. It's not for God. It's for us. It's I suppose my understanding of it is that it served a similar social function as the role of corporate confession does in the Divine Liturgy and in the Mass, where like in the liturgy, preparatory for communion, for Eucharist, for gratitude is a sober recollection of our deviations and our waywardness.
Right.
Not to feel shitty about
Yeah.
ourselves, but like it seems to be a part of the pattern.
Right. Yeah, it explicitly earlier in Hebrews says that the sacrifices did not remove deviation, did not remove sin. That wasn't even the purpose of them.
Yeah.
It was to bring awareness of them, keep us being not getting just so used to it that we forget that that's even what it is.
Yes.
Bring our attention back to it so that we can correct it. It's like the metaphor that you've used is the rumble strips on the side of the highway.
Yeah.
When you start hitting that, it brings your attention to like, oh, I'm veering off course. I better correct. That's the purpose of these sacrifices in the first place, of the sin offerings. And that's that. Well, we use the phrase genuine consciousness down a few verses from here.
Yes.
And that's what it's for. Is that genuinely being conscious of what I'm doing, how I'm living, in order to promote well-being and goodness, flourishing.
Yeah. Yeah. It is actually part of how to be a good neighbor, how to be keeping familial love present. It's not shame, it's not a sense of guilt, it's a sense of truthfulness, including about the way in which we do. Yeah, we're gonna keep on hurting each other.
It's gonna happen.
Yeah,
and you correct it, you bring it back.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an intentional hitting of the rumble strips. Like to remember that's what this feels like. And I think that's important to say on this podcast because non-conservative, I suppose, Christianity, I don't really find the word progressive that helpful in this world, but like often I think a lot of people who may not agree with us would say, oh, you guys, you progressives don't believe in sin, you don't believe in wrongdoing, you don't believe in, all these things. And it's like I can speak for myself here and say, no, yeah, absolutely, we screw up. Absolutely, sobriety about the way in which I can hurt other people. And mar the image of God in myself and others. It's got to be part of how I and we grow. Of course, deviation exists. It's not a fiction. It's what's a fiction is that God needs violence as part of what to do about that.
Right.
Or that a perpetual guilty feeling is a sign of maturity. I suppose. Like there's a lot of things we could say about it. One of them that we will not say is that deviations and talking about deviations is passe or puritanical.
Yeah, how we talk about it matters.
Yeah. So It's part of the preparatory
Yeah.
work of being the priest of Christ, making us all priests.
Yeah. And that it involves going outside the camp, just like he did.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. And in fact, the who is outside the camp in the parts of the story that we find in Torah? It's people who are menstruating. It's
Hmm.
the
Women who have
eunuchs.
recently given birth,
Yeah, people who've recently
eunuchs.
given birth, like
Yeah.
all kinds of things that have nothing to do with harming their neighbor.
Right.
Um,
People with diseases like leprosy.
yeah, yeah. The people who are outside is where you have to go to find your anointing. If you want to find your calling as a priest to God Most High, uh, get away from your tent. Get outside the huddle. Huddles are great, good, keep you warm, safe, and fed. And um, you're going to find the pillar of the cloud at the tent of meeting outside the camp.
Mm-hmm.
Those who have ears to hear.
Yeah.
There's pretty solid parallels. So, I mean, part of what is it? Our Hebrews 2 episode is called Solidarity, Not Suffering. Like this is how the whole thing has always worked. It's just been enacted differently. The pattern is
Right.
built into it. And here in the final couple verses here on this paragraph, therefore, because of him, we may present a sacrificial offering of gratitude to God throughout everything, which is the fruit of our lips, acknowledging his name. So do not neglect promoting well-being and sharing, because God is pleased with sacrificial offerings like these. Like, this is what we mean when we say that, like, gratitude and sharing and doxology, confession and reflection on the character of ultimate reality of the divine, they're all the same. Like gratitude and generosity and confession of God, truthful confession of God.
Mm.
They're all blended together. And that sacrifice, like, there's a funny thing here. One of the overarching patterns in Hebrews is the way in which we do not cling to the penultimate, but look to the ultimate, which is Christ. Penultimate being Torah, priests, angels, da 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 da, all these things that are good, but look to the ultimate. But then they're not doing away with sacrificial. Oh, there we go. Thank you for those watching. Apparently, my computer just gave a thumbs up bubble. Um, don't look to sorry, Priscilla is not saying forget about sacrifice. Like, the kind of sacrifice that God is looking for is sharing, grounded in generosity
Mm-hmm.
and familial love, staying present. And in
Yeah.
doing that,
Which,
that is actually
which there is a
that's an
bit of
expression of the
letting go,
ultimate.
giving of what you have, which
Mm-hmm.
is part of the sacrifice, but it's not a donation to your church tithe that it's talking about,
Yeah.
or killing an animal, or
Yeah.
whatever. It's for what you have with others who need it.
Yeah. And if we're all priests, and if the sacrifice system was, among other things, a way of making sure the priests are fed, they had a very
Mm-hmm.
high meat diet. Um,
Yeah.
there was a redistribution there to the clergy, um,
Mm-hmm.
and we're all priests in some sense. Therefore, do that, and if you want to see the ultimate, cling to the ultimate, not the penultimate. See Christ, not that which points to Christ. Sharing is it. Gratitude is it. Like, these are incarnations of the Christ, of the ultimate. That's familial love staying present.
Mm-hmm.
Show me your faith, I'll show you my works. Says
Mm-hmm.
another character in the canon. Anything else we want to play with in 13 before we recap this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's good.
Okay, yeah. So what's what shape what has taken shape for you in as you translated Hebrews and as we've talked about it over these past
Mm-hmm.
few months?
Yeah, I mean, I think connecting the dots primarily from the very first couple of verses, God spoke through his son,
Mm.
to chapter 6, where the the basics of teaching about Messiah being take care of each other, love each other, um, and that anything, including even teaching about resurrection, is secondary to that.
Mm.
Like it's explicitly listed as one of the secondary things. Not a bad thing, not a wrong thing to teach, but until you've got the love each other part down, it doesn't really matter very much.
And you may not actually understand resurrection until you understand love.
Right. Yeah.
Like we
Trying to go
love
into
our way
those.
into a new way of thinking. And there are hidden gems in there that only the heart of love, a life of
Yeah.
love, is able to apprehend in the empty tomb.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They're secondary, not in that they're not important, but that they're more advanced. And you can't understand the advanced topics until you have gotten a firm grasp on the basics.
Mm-hmm. And the power here is that the basics are practiced,
Mm-hmm.
um, not only stated.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah. And it's taking us through that to the long stuff about Melchizedek and all that. Um,
yeah,
into chapter 12 was the really load bearing place for me,
yeah,
where it starts to get really into the nitty gritty of so what does this look like as a community? We're meeting each other's basic needs, making sure everyone has food and shelter and clothing, that no one's being left out. Nobody is being left out of this.
mm-hmm.
That no one's being left out of God's rest, like having to constantly work and toil just to survive. If anyone is having to live like that paycheck to paycheck, and not sure they're going to have enough, the community is failing.
Yep, yep. And it's remarkable how much, even in chapter 12, there is I use this word very respectfully, but a mythologizing of some very basic things of sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Like so much of our sacred imagination is meant to embellish and elaborate on and fuel taking care of each other and being thankful.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, it feels like a lot of the letter is like written at a 201 at the advanced course level to like loop
Mm-hmm.
back in and deepen that 101 thing of like freaking love each other. Like,
Yeah. Well, it's if you're talking about mythologizing, it's really taking it back to the original calling of what it means to be human, that serving as God's representatives, showing creation, showing other people who God is by never abandoning, never forsaking them.
yeah.
That's who God is. That's what we are to be too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this book has, I've said this before, has absolutely startled me. Um For a long time, Hebrews was my favorite of all of the letters, but not for any of the reasons that it's grown in the past few months talking through this. There's just a lot of like images and turns of phrase, and the like relentless Christocentrism of it all always fascinated me, um, even where it was often very confusing and weird. And I was so it felt funny with it being having such a tender place in my heart historically, to like I wasn't sure what was going to happen when we get into the translation of this stuff because it's such a weird ass book. But I've been thrilled and startled and challenged by the one of the most complicated books having such a very simple, practical core.
Yeah, it's not complicated point. A complicated argument to get there.
Yes.
For us anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe not so much for the original readers, but yeah, the point of it's pretty simple.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I'm losing my words, so that's probably a sign to wrap this thing up.
Sure. Yeah.
So we're going to be taking a little bit of a break here in production again, hopefully not as long as last time between seasons, but Brandon, do you want to share what the next season is going to be exploring?
Yeah, we're going to venture into the daunting waters of Paul's letters to the Romans.
Oh my God. I'm so excited for this. It is such a important letter in the life of the church historically, and such a frickin' battleground. At least Protestants love to beat the shit out of each other with it.
Right. Yeah, no, I put off translating it for a while because I was nervous. but I finally did it, and now we're going to talk about it.
Excellent. I am hyped for that. Listeners, we may well leak the PDF of that earlier if you feel like giving that a read. I think it's going to be a very consequential season for us in understanding how to hold some of the most like denominations are built around some of these freaking verses, right? So like, let's get into it. Let's lose some friends and make new ones.
Yeah, basically.
Along the way. Yeah, well, thank you all for journeying with us as we learn from Fresh Ways of Hearing, our sister Priscilla, in this letter or sermon to the Hebrews. We are always so grateful for your remaining present with us. The best way to support Founding Translation is to leave us a rating or review on whatever website or podcast player you are enjoying this on. It makes it easier for more people to find the show. And if you enjoyed it in one medium, check out the other ones. If you're watching us on YouTube, try listening to us on a walk. If you're listening to us on a walk, our body language may be expressive of a little bit more. Try it on YouTube or Facebook. Second best way to support the show is to become a sponsor for just $5 a month. When you do that, you get comment access on the Translations Google Doc, as well as the satisfaction that you are supporting exceptionally nerdy independent media. You can find the link to join the community in the show notes. The music you're listening to is by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com. Founding Translation was produced by Perry FM on unceded Chinook and Kalapuya land. Goodbye, Brandon.
Bye, Brandon.
Bye, everybody. See you next season.